to this session of the Climate Bonds Annual Conference Green Transitions Conference. This is about resilience. This is about transition to resilience in what is going to be a century of volatility. And what we're learning from this particular crisis, we're in the pandemic crisis, which has to be understood as a crisis of our ecosystems. This is about pathogens jumping between species as a result of degraded environments. It's something that's been predicted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the last 25 years as becoming a feature of a world in climate crisis, the 21st century. So in some ways, you can look at this pandemic as the first of the major climate crises of the 21st century. We will have more. It won't just be wildfires in California, as is happening right now. It won't just be terrible floods in Bangladesh, which was a couple of weeks ago. It will be global impacts too, such as the pandemic, the first pandemic that we've all been able to speak about in real time on the internet and communicate as a result. So we need to prepare our societies to deal with the kind of volatility that is already becoming a norm. What does it look like? It's clearly more than infrastructure hardening, that is protecting the coastline of the Netherlands, Bangladesh, the Nile Delta against floods. It's also about economic resilience, social resilience, and ecosystem resilience, which means biodiversity, because biodiversity is an indicator of resilience, and collapsing biodiversity, which is what we are experiencing right now on this planet, is an indicator of ecosystem serious ill health. So that's the background to this. We have a fantastic panel to join us today. First, a word of our sponsors. Nothing happens in terms of this conference without the incredible support of our sponsors, who are doing more than supporting the conference. They're also rolling out financial products, tools that allow capital to move. I've just been speaking to JP Morgan about their new Green and Climate Bond Index. We need more of that ecosystem of change, like the Luxembourg Green Exchange has given us. We need the bankers to get the deals out the door. And so we're privileged to have Goldman Sachs, HSBC, Credit Suisse, BNP Paribas as part of this. We need the investment banks, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Banks, to green their portfolios. And we heard a powerful statement yesterday from Jin LeCun saying AIB will not be funding coal and will be going green. And they've got a $500 million mandate pursuing climate bonds at the moment. That's something we announced yesterday. And of course, data to make this all happen, Refinitiv. Thank you, sponsors, and thank you for our language sponsors and our session sponsors like Moody's and BBVA and Mizuho and Allianz Bernstein. And even thank you to the Green Finance Center in Nur Sultan in Kazakhstan, who produced, organized, delivered a few weeks ago, Kazakhstan's first ever green bond, $500 million to finance renewable energy by SMEs. We have 5 languages. Translation is live now. We'll try and get Nick Robbins to speak slowly, but he does get excitable. But just a warning to our speakers, think about the translators. You can ask questions in the Wova app. By now, you should know how to do that. This is a resilience conversation. Our first speaker is Preety Bhandari. She's the Chief of Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management. Note the bringing the two together at the Asian Development Bank. We will then hear from Marcos Neto, my good friend, who's my guru, who I always follow, just to make that very clear, Marcos, who's the Director of the Finance Sector Hub at UNDP. And then Rathin Roy, who is a Climate Bonds Senior Advisor, who's also the new Managing Director of ODI in the UK and a former member of Indian Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council and many other things. Dr. Rhian Marie Thomas, who is the, I'm going to say, charismatic CEO of the Green Finance Institute in the UK. He's been doing fantastic work. And then my old friend, Nick Robbins, sorry, he's not old, we've been friends for a long time, just to make that clear. He's now a professor at the London School of Economics and Sustainable Finance. Preety, over to you.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you for the invitation to this panel. And what I'm really excited about is how you have defined the whole construct of resilience, which is beyond the physical aspects of resilience, to bring in also, you know, the social, economic, and ecosystems aspect. And what is probably what needs to be added to the title is financial resilience, and I will come back to that later in my conversation. And you know, there are more qualified people on this panel to take it up also later in the conversation. But what I wanted to start with in my intervention is, you know, what lessons are we learning from the current context, the COVID-19 context? And it has clearly shown that we are not prepared for shocks. We are not prepared for crises of this magnitude. Our societies and economies have been really caught by surprise. And, you know, be it the current pandemic or future pandemics or the long-term climate, you know, all that we are talking about, how do we ensure that this does not repeat itself? So that's the first thing I wanted to highlight. The second one was, you know, we've also learned some harsh lessons about the systemic risks, how we have not accounted for those. You know, exposing that how our health systems, food systems, social security systems, and the like are interconnected, trade and connectivity, and how we need to look at them in that conjoint manner. And also, you know, the underlying drivers of vulnerability, be it, you know, entrenched poverty, or be it linked to social exclusion, gender inequality, all these have come to the fore when we are seeing the impact of COVID-19. And then, you know, again, it underscores the relevance of looking at it in a more systemic manner, whatever the crisis, be it climate or be it pandemics or otherwise, or other disasters. So that is the second lesson. And the third one relates to the scale of the challenge. And, you know, we have seen a short-term reduction in emissions. We have all marveled at the blue skies, at the clean rivers, and nature reclaiming, you know, its due. But we also realize that this is short-term. And what is uncanny is that we are expecting, you know, about a 5 to 10% decline in emissions in 2020 due to the low economic activity in this year. And this is exactly the range of emission reductions that is required over the next decade to reach the Paris goals. So are we talking about such a sustained low level of economic activity to be able to reach the Paris goals? Obviously not, you know. Economic growth and climate action can be mutually reinforcing as well. But, you know, these are the kind of questions that some policymakers are raising or are being raised by other stakeholders as well. And as the, you know, great financial crisis also showed, there was a dip in emissions, but it bounced back. So, you know, how do we ensure that we don't bounce back? So these are the three contextual, you know, elements that I wanted to highlight before going on to the opportunity. And the opportunity is, you know, whatever we do in terms of the stimulus and recovery packages, those systems are going to be there for decades to come. And how do we ensure that we are not locking ourselves again into, you know, the kind of risks that we did in the past? And this is the opportunity, you know, for green, inclusive, and resilient recovery. Of course, there have been different assessments which have shown that this has not happened until now. But the fact is that, you know, what the governments are looking at just now are a menu of options which will reinforce economic growth, which will create employment. And not all of them are supporting a long-term vision of building green or building resilience. So how can we enable the governments? And this is where, you know, recently we at the Asian Development Bank have produced a framework for assessment of these options, you know, how the governments are looking at different screens to kickstart the economies again. So what they're looking for is, you know, initiatives which can be implemented in the short term, which can generate jobs, which can enable reskilling, which can look at robust supply chains, be it more localized or diversified sources of procurement. They're looking at high economic multipliers. So which of these elements are also embedded in our low carbon and climate resilient initiatives? Where is the mapping and where is the evidence that we can provide to the governments to ensure that it is a mutually reinforcing objectives that we are dealing with the large funds of financing that will come through for kickstarting the economies. So this framework of assessment was released recently, and we are already in conversation with a couple of governments in Southeast Asia to pilot test this framework. And we are very excited, if we have a couple of governments who can lead the way by using this framework, then there is that opportunity to scale up, to demonstrate that it is possible. So I am happy to share the link to that particular framework that we have developed later on with the participants, but that is where the art of the possible is. And to sum up, what I would say is, there are three things that we have to look at moving forward. First is we have to think long. I know the policymakers have a 5-year or a 4-year horizon, but this crisis has shown us that we have to think long, and we have to change the narrative from risks to opportunities. We haven't done that very well, from either the academia or the think tanks, or even, from financial institutions per se. The second one relates to, looking at resilience, as you have very, very rightly, pointed out, in all its dimensions. And together with that, looking at what are the underlying drivers of vulnerability. Let's not forget that, poverty is still a big issue in many countries around the world, and social exclusion is still an issue. Gender inequality is still an issue. So, how can we capture those vulnerabilities moving forward while designing a robust response? And the third is, incentives and financing. And, colleagues over here are very well versed with the cash-strapped, economies, really, getting to respond to this crisis has been difficult. But, if you're compounding those risks, where is the funding and financing going to come from? The public financing is limited. So, what are the opportunities for mobilizing other sources of financing, I think is an important element also, if we are talking of a green, inclusive, and resilient recovery as the next host of the UN Climate Conference UK are urging all of us to embark on. Thank you.
Thank you, Preety. You said a couple of interesting things. Most interesting, you're working with a couple of governments already. So this is a live project.
It is going to go live. We are in initial conversations with the government, and we are very enthused by their response in taking this up. So it is work in progress to get them on board fully.
Okay. We'll be very keen to see how you go with that. For those of you that are interested, the summary paper that Preety's team put out is linked on the session information in your conference app. So have a look at that, which is the document that Preety and I have spoken about. But there's another longer version coming out soon, and there's a lot more information. You said a couple of interesting things about the need for evidence for governments. And I can announce right now, just before Marco speaks, that we've just published a climate bonds statement on COVID recovery and resilience, which is our view about where this has got to go and the opportunity for resilience bonds for governments. We're looking for comment about it. It's a draft statement. We want to try and build a community of support behind it. We already know that these speakers are broadly supportive about it. They've got a copy about it. We'll see what they actually say. But one of the things we've said is the need for evidence-based standards. And what we haven't had enough of in the past is solid evidence being used to justify what should and can and must be done, rather than just being an opinion And then that can support sovereign issuance and also can be linked to the transparency, the reporting and transparency features that are the great thing we've pioneered as a thematic market. So you can actually see where the money's going and you get reporting on it, which is a bit of an inoculation against some of the unfortunate practices of the 80s and 90s in sovereign issuance that we've seen in some countries, which has scared off investors. So a lot of investors are saying the thing they like most about the green bond market isn't just the green aspect, it's the reporting and transparency aspects and the seeing through of it. So there's a few things there. I commend that paper to you. Marcos, you and I have been talking for a long time about how to translate the SDGs into guidance for the market. You've done some work on that. And the key thing for our listeners to share with them that we've talked about is the critical importance of understanding that the SDGs are actually indicators of resilience. That is, they are indicators of climate resilience, folks. These are not two separate markets. These are not two separate discussions. It's the one discussion when you start looking at all the actual aspects of risks and predictability of risk going forward. Have I stolen your thunder, Marcos? Over to you.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, colleagues. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you, Sean, for inviting me here. I'm Marcus Neto. I'm the director of the United Nations Development Program Finance Sector Hub. And whatever I say today, if you don't like it, blame Rathin. He was a UNDP and helped create the job that I now have. So, in that sense. But let me tell, and I think Preety put it in a good point in there. And let me bring to you perhaps what is going on around the governments of the world. On May 28th this year, the Secretary General called a high-level event in which 50 heads of governments and states took part to talk about the financing of the COVID recovery, but from the beginning, linked to the Decade of Action of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. Now, that 28th of May meeting has led to a process, which we are halfway through until the end of this year, with 6 working groups, co-chairs by member states of the United Nations, dealing with debt, dealing with liquidity, dealing with illicit financial flow, with private creditors, as Preety was talking about. And one of the groups is entirely dedicated not so much to the immediate, but to the medium to the long term. It's called Recover Better for Sustainability. That group is facilitated by UNDP, by my team, and is led by the European Union, the United Kingdom, and the governments of Rwanda and Fiji. But it has participation of more than 100 stakeholders from government, civil society, academia, and business in that sense. Now, 2 days ago, and this is fresh, right? 75 finance ministers have come together under the auspice of the process in the UN to listen to the policy menu, the menu of policy recommendations that are coming from these groups, right? Now, for any one of you know, it is quite unusual to have finance ministers, having a conversation in the UN. They tend to go to the World Bank, they tend to go to other places. And in this time, you actually had the finance ministers in the UN talking, like virtually like we're doing now, but also having the IMF there and the World Bank there and others all in that. Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF, gave the keynote speech on this meeting. And on the 29th of September, the heads of states and the heads of government will come back to have a conversation about those recommendations made. So let me quickly tell you, in terms of the recovery, in terms of the resilience nature, the nature of the recovery, right? Our group put forward, 4 major areas, if you want, 4 major objectives that this recovery must achieve. 1, it must build resilient health systems with universal health access around the world. It must implement Paris Agreement. It must deal with environmentally sustainable dynamic economies, the biodiversity losses, and the climate crisis. It must make available digitalization. We've seen what is going on with education right now, when half of the kids in the world have no reliable connectivity, no reliable internet. So we have to deal with the digitization in this economy, but also to deal with the digital finance aspects, how digital finance can propagate growth and propagate elements on this recovery. And the fourth element, it must tackle the inequalities. UNDP last Human Development Report, which we've been publishing for 30 years, last 2019 was entirely dedicated to inequality and identifying new elements that can exacerbate existing inequalities, like the climate crisis and digital gap in that sense. Now, the crisis, and I think Rathin knows this very well from his time with UNDP, is for the first time in 30 years of UNDP publishing the Human Development Index, we are going to see an overall drop on the index. So human development is going backwards for the first time in the history of the Human Development Index. That is the challenge that we have here. But as Prime Minister Winston Churchill said once, let's not let a crisis go to waste. How do we make this to do profoundly change, as Preet talked about it, in the conceptualization of what we value as society? You know, in that sense, the group that we've been facilitating with the governments is putting forward recommendations that go from and what Sean and his statement, and I congratulate the Climate Bond Initiative for this statement, global norms and standards. There has to be a move in putting global norms and standards in place. We can no longer afford a world in which we all congratulate ourselves and says that we have a trillions or 35 trillions or how many trillions on ESG, environmental, social, and government, not knowing if that is really legit and is really doing what needs to do, right, in terms of this. We no longer can accept that corporations goes around the world and pat themselves on the back and saying, I have a wonderful corporate social responsibilities, but their disclosure is not up to par, and we are not really seeing the right picture, right? So we are putting forward a set of recommendations around the alignment of money, the alignment of business models, the need to tighten up disclosure and reporting, the need to have standards on carbon pricing around the world, right? Now, we at UNDP, as Sean mentioned, have been working on two initiatives around this big push for global. One, and Sean is part of it, we are working with OECD at the request of the G7 to be launching in November a new global sustainable finance framework that deals with standards, regulations, and instruments, right? And we also set up in a set of practice standards for private equity, bonds, and enterprises called SDG Impact that can help a company internalize on a daily business those processes going forward. Now, the group is also saying that governments have an essential role here to align their finance with the NDCs, the disaster risk reductions, right, the resilience side, and a new instrument of planning, if you want, to put behind the SDG plans and necessary finance is what we are working with 52 governors around the world calling Integrate National Financial Frameworks as the UN. We are making recommendations for central banks and financial supervisors that they have to find a way to integrate, into financial stability monitoring, macro and micro prudential supervision, right, of the standards of socioeconomic and environment. And here is important because we're talking about the bonds. In 3 months of this year, the social bond market has grown threefold, from 10 billion to 33 billion. So the pandemic has shown a growth on the social bonds market, which then links to the issue that Sean and I have been talking, that is important for us not to create a separate market. It's important for us to look at the green bond, the social bond, the SDG bond as an integral market. You can call it the SDG, where green is inside and social is inside it, blue, whatever you want it. But it's important that we keep one market because otherwise we're going to fragment it going forward in that sense, right? Now, I'm going to stop soon just to say that we also made recommendations to the business community, to private sector. We've made recommendations to the credit ratings. It is essential that credit ratings have started to integrate social and environmental indicators inside how they calculate the ratings, right? It can't be business as usual, otherwise we miss the opportunity of transformation that this crisis offers us going forward. And finally, we made a set of recommendations for public financial institutions. There is going to be an interesting conference in November in Paris, the Finance Common Summit, which will bring for the first time together 400 national development and MDB banks from around the world. And what we are recommending is that we are recommending for the governments that own those banks and own the DFIs of the world to change their mandate, if necessary, their bylaws, to make them have to deliver the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, right? That's an essential element here, right? Now, this whole conversation and the importance of bonds and the fact that, you know, the IMF was saying on this meeting that the global economy is looking a bit better than its worth predictions, but 88% of all the fiscal stimulus in the world is in industrialized countries. Only 0.2% of fiscal stimulus are in Africa, right? The issue of how do developing countries, in particular Africa and small development states, which are considered too risky or middle income countries and have no access to concessional finance, are going to finance this recovery without indebting them forever, is a fundamental challenge going forward. You know, and it's not just a matter of extending the DSSI for until the end of next year, and even covering, you know, SIDS in other countries on the DSSI standstill. Is a fundamental need to do that restructuring, and do that restructuring in a way that you freed up money for climate, for social issues, for tackling inequality, right? Otherwise, there will be no money for this transformation that we want to see. You know, thank you.
Thank you, Marcos. Strong words and powerful words. Rathin, over to you.
Thank you. That was a very good segue for me to come in. So let's just take stock, since I've been asked to talk about macroeconomics, about where we are, before we come to things like poverty. We are going to see the global economy shrink. And we're going to see almost every country in the world except China, if you believe their numbers, shrink. And you're going to see large middle-income countries like India, almost the entire continent of sub-Saharan Africa, shrink from what are already very low levels of per capita GDP. That would mean that the consumption abilities of the vast majority of people on this planet would have declined, and they would have declined because they would have lost opportunities to earn money, right? For example, in the UK, you might see a 14% decline in GDP, but if 10% of that comes from a decline in profits and the consumption hit is not high. The difference in developing countries and emerging economies is that the consumption hit is high, much higher than in developed countries. And if the consumption hit is high, then the growth story of many of these countries is bust, because the growth story depends on investment. And if global economies are shrinking, there's nothing to sell to them. And if domestic economies are shrinking, there's nothing to sell to domestic citizens. Hence, the rhetoric has been government needs to step in and spend more. If private agents are not consuming or investing, then government must invest. Now, there are two ways in which governments can do this. They can give money temporarily, that's a fiscal stimulus, to consumers who spend money and then investment happens, or they can themselves invest money. So the question of financing government spending, which is at the center of the global debate, is about mobilizing spending to do these things. But as we have found in my recent job in India, the trouble is that if first your scope to do this is limited, and second, to keep this conversation at the macroeconomic level may not achieve the intended outcome, because my consumer who has lost his job, if that person gets a handout, that person is going to go and bank it because they don't know where the next job is coming from. That is not going to be true when the bars of New Delhi open today, as they have, with appropriate social distancing, if such a thing is ever possible in India, which I very much doubt. Then relatively rich people will go out and have a drink. So you will see visible inequality of consumption exacerbating, with due apologies to Marcos, to Brazilian standards across the world. That can lead to political and social conflict. And therefore, to join with Marcos, the key macroeconomic question has become, as I've been saying, and I started saying that in UNDP, you want me to mobilize fiscal space. I said this to my Ministry of Finance. I've been saying this globally in a coalition we have with Danny Roderick. Now you can't just talk about more fiscal space. You have to specify fiscal space for what? What are you going to spend money on? How is that going to give you social returns? And those social returns can come in the form of growth and restoration of income and consumption, fine. But they also need to come in terms of providing reassurance to consumers and investors that we will get out of this crisis in ways that make them feel comfortable that they will not fall between the cracks or the chasms. And going forward, when we have future crises like this, that restoration will reside against those crises. So I think the major intellectual change that we wanted has already happened. We're asking fiscal space for what? And I think here is the opportunity, because fiscal space for growth can happen by, I'll give you an example from my personal life. Having joined UNDP, having joined ODI, I happen not to be a white Britisher. So it is a factoid that by my joining, the pay diversity between ethnic minorities, which I'm not, but I will be if I work in Britain, and everybody else will fall. It's an arithmetic, right? Other things remaining constant, it will fall. But that doesn't mean that the inequality of all ethnic minorities in Britain has improved at my level of income. So if I am not able to administer macroeconomic policy in a way that guards against inequality, then I have a problem. And to administer macroeconomic policy in a way that guards against inequality, I have a challenge, because very few countries in the world have done that. We have been saying for 30 years that to have higher growth, you must accept inequality in its different dimensions. The best way to remove inequality is not to give handouts. That's why I dislike universal basic income, because it gives up on the challenge of inclusive growth. I have a paper in Portuguese, Marcos will be interested to know, called Productivo Inclusão, which means that growth is inclusive when people participate in delivering it. And the only way people can participate in delivering it, if we have more entrepreneurs, more people working with these entrepreneurs, if people are gainfully occupied, if the labor force is paid well. So it becomes incumbent upon macroeconomic policy to make sure this happens, and this happens by raising productivity. On the investment side, this is where climate bonds and other such bonds come in very importantly. Because what is my metric for raising productivity across the economy so that the dividend I get can be distributed better? The metric has to be that these investments are sustainable and demonstrably resilient. What the climate bonds process does is provides a prudential check that that is happening if you accept the premise, which I do, which is why I'm a senior advisor with climate bonds, that in my experience of climate investments, good ones, all of them, and I mean all of them, increase productivity, whether in the energy sector, whether in agriculture, whether anywhere else. The payback you get from climate bonds is the fact that they can demonstrably and prudentially secure that much needed increase in productivity. But the second dimension is if we administer these bonds well in conjunction with other policies to secure what Nick would call a just transition, because this is a transition. You've got a shock and now you have to transit from being a lower growth economy globally and nationally to being a higher growth economy. This is a transition. And in this transition, we want to see employment and we want to see resilience. Then this transition must demonstrate that the investments we make with climate bonds or any other bonds that seek to secure sustainability and resilience also pay due attention to inequality, and this is where the macroeconomic framework comes in. So a typical financing strategy circa 2024, in my opinion, would not be looking at, that's why I'm not worried about debt, will not be looking at debt sustainability defined as a metric that is defined by through an econometric model that is defined through 2 standard deviations in terms of ability to pay. Debt sustainability will be defined going forward if that debt did create, and we need metrics for this, tangible assets that promote productivity and improve resilience. And that is where I think climate bonds can play a huge role and many other instruments, but we need to have a more joined up conversation about this. That is where I want rating agencies to go, to understand that to keep these economies from these frightening shocks, that resilience must reflect in the metrics and the weights that are used to calculate the quality of economic growth and the quality of GDP growth, which means the composition of that growth and the composition of the GDP asset stock, national wealth, and what it is doing in terms of involving people in the growth process is made explicit and incorporated in the ratings. They have to get less lazy about this. And I know, and I'm glad to see that, and I know that some of them are actually following this conference, that they're looking for ideas on this. And I think climate bonds and others here could play a huge role in helping them do so. I want to make 2 final points. In the space that you are all in, and I am in sort of half, which is the climate space, I think it is important to acknowledge that we need to see more discussions in this climate world about inequality and employment than we have been doing so far. We need to see far more attention paid to whether these products are going to promote the reduction in inequality in all its dimensions and employment than they do so far. It cannot just be an approach where you threaten, where it effectively sounds like a threat on the other side. People with dire consequences in terms of oceans flooding Bombay if you don't do good things about the environment. You can do that. But you also have to talk about how these investments will promote equity and will promote resilience at the human level, which means resilience of the communities and citizens who participate in the economy against shocks. That necessarily means, and that's my final point, that we will all have to start getting out of the energy fixation that carbon emission Jesuitical rhetoric has consistently informed the world by. The opportunities I see for climate bonds in India are not confined to energy. We have climate bonds that work in the railways. We have climate bonds that should be working in irrigation and agriculture. There is a recognition in emerging economies, including Brazil and India, notwithstanding the current regimes, that agriculture cannot be treated anymore as a bargain sector. Agriculture has saved our bacon, our chapati, can't say bacon, our chapati in this particular COVID. And therefore, having an effective, productive agricultural sector where farmers make money is important. And therefore, this mantra of grow more food, grow more ethanol, grow more, so that the macroeconomy can grow is no longer good enough. We will have to pay attention to methods and techniques that keep agriculture sustainable. There's a huge role, all such methods and techniques I showed you contribute to the cause of reducing carbon emissions. But that spotlight on agriculture, that spotlight on transport, and that spotlight on cities, I think is the need of the hour at the non-macroeconomic level. So my dream is to see in the next 3 or 4 years, and I hope to work on this at ODI, including with HMG and FCDO and our other partners, that at the macroeconomic level, we get metrics and signals that show us that unemployment and inequality matter, and that sustainability and resilience are concerns. At the sector level, from all sectors, we recognize these as our common resilience and sustainability challenges. The climate, the future of the environment, unemployment and inequality. And now we commence to have not a siloed, but a shared conversation on how we can therefore effect such investments in ways that promote resilience and sustainability in a much broader range of sectors than we were doing before. And here finally comes finance. And I want to make this point and make it every year. Finance follows ideas and changes. It cannot lead. So if opportunities can be identified to do these things in all these dimensions, as I've been telling the government of India, they've not listened to me for the last 6 months, don't worry about your budget. I'll find you the money. There are several methods and techniques, including green bonds, where we can find the money. Consider a world where you issue a climate bond in perpetuity. It's called a consort, similar to what the EU has done, and I've been telling the government of India to do, and they don't listen for the last 6 months. You give them an attractive rate of return. All the precautionary savings in the economy will flow into those bonds, and because they're climate bonds, you will have that resilience check to make sure that the returns you get in a 3 to 5 year period are good. And effectively, that means that these climate bonds are debt sustainable, right? Let me give you a final example of what I'm saying as a summary snapshot. This is what you do when you end a war and you rebuild well. When you end a war and you rebuild well, you have limited resources. And if you succeed Churchill, because Marcos quoted him, you ask, what is it I can do to build my country back? And the answer there is, what do I spend on? And it's not just you spend on building steel plants and coal plants in the UK or Germany or anywhere else ravaged by war. You also spend on education. You spend on the future of your children. You organize a national health service. You do these things because you understand that these things are important to rebuild. I think that's the world we are in. And that is why I'm confident that climate bonds and other such financial products, which have in a sense anticipated this need to mainstream, are going to be the mainstream going forward, if we take the right decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rathin. Listeners, one of the key principles behind what we're doing of green bonds and climate bonds is pursuing this idea that ideas change things, that conceptual frameworks change things. The whole idea of a climate bond, a green bond, a sustainable bond is to get you to start thinking that you will get returns, in a way that also addresses the challenges of the planet. You've heard today from our first 3 speakers, elaborations, details of these ideas that are so critical now at this inflection point in our history, this incredible inflection point of our history to take forward. I now want to go to Rhian, who's been thinking exactly along these lines in the context of the UK economy and also in the context of the City of London's role in the global economy. Rhian.
Thank you ever so much, Sean, and thank you for inviting me to join today's panel. Before I start my comments, may I state my support for your resilient recovery paper, in particular, your call for a unified set of resilient recovery principles. And I really would encourage the participants today to take a moment to review it too. It is only 2 pages, which again, I also welcome. I feel particularly inspired by the title of our session today, like Preety, because it refers to the economic, social, and ecosystem resilience. And it is evident that in solving for resilience with respect to climate change and environmental degradation, we are also solving for the economic and social challenges that we face. The pathway to net zero is the pathway to prosperity. In fact, it's the only pathway. There wasn't an intellectually coherent high carbon route to economic growth before COVID. There certainly isn't one now, as was so remarkably highlighted by DNV, a leading energy forecaster who published their annual energy transition outlook yesterday, with an extraordinary conclusion that COVID will have a permanent impact on demand for fossil fuels, such that peak demand was reached in 2019. So basically, COVID has brought forward their previous prediction of a peak by 2027 by 8 years. So reaching peak fossil fuel demand means future overcapacity, it means lower prices, lower profitability, it means restructuring last century energy system for the green solutions of the 21st century. The underperformance of many operators in the energy sector over the last few years shows that investors are increasingly aware of those risks. The DNV analysis it's publicly available. and it provides a really optimistic assessment of the prospects of curbing emissions from fossil fuels. But it also notes that we need more political will to drive the transition much faster if we are to achieve the goals of Paris. And obviously I agree with that statement. The markets are still failing to price the externalities. And so in order to channel more capital towards green solutions, we're going to need greater collaboration between public and private finance to accelerate investment in infrastructure and in technology. Hopefully that all sounds good, but what does that actually mean in practice? In the UK, in the run-up to COP, we've got an unmissable opportunity to explore impactful, practical mechanisms at scale. Issue a UK green sovereign bond, establish a national investment bank, and introduce a clear trajectory for carbon pricing differentiated by sector to be charged on the producers of greenhouse gases. My fellow panelist and good friend, certainly not an old friend, Professor Nick Robbins, and we've been working with the Impact Investing Institute to explore how a UK green sovereign bond could play a critical role in not only delivering the UK's net zero commitment, but also in addressing the urgent challenges of social inequality, very much building on his just transition work. So I'm sure Nick will address this in his remarks. So I'll speak instead about how one potential application of the green gilt proceeds could be to seed a new national investment bank for the UK, with a mandate as a risk mitigation vehicle to co-create new investment opportunities and channel both public and private capital towards defined real economy, tangible net zero outcomes. So such an investment bank, it could play several roles. It would finance innovations and infrastructure that are critical for realizing the UK's net zero commitment, but which also remain unattractive to the private sector at present. So they could include unfamiliar or unproven technologies such as carbon capture storage, green hydrogen, clean maritime or aviation solutions, as well as long-term construction projects. The value of such a role, I feel, is evidenced by the UK government's former Green Investment Bank, which successfully de-risked emerging offshore wind technologies, creating new financial markets and crowding in private capital. And to Rathin's point, by 2030, the offshore wind market in the UK is forecast not only to deliver more than a third of our electricity, it is also predicted to provide 27,000 jobs. It is a powerful and really practical case study of effective public-private collaboration. So I do think it's worth elaborating on it just for a moment. The Green Investment Bank overcame the investment gaps, but it did so in conjunction with other significant measures that were put in place by the policymakers in order to rapidly develop the offshore wind industry, specifically providing financial incentives in the forms of contracts for difference that lowered the high investment hurdle rates faced by project developers and investors at the start, the alignment of seabed leasing processes, and the structured bidding rounds for access and construction permissions, and also the competitive bidding rounds to auction available offshore wind capacity that then so clearly highlighted the investment opportunity. So in summary, breaking down that case study into a potentially replicable blueprint in other sectors, it involved identifying untapped high potential technologies, targeting barriers with specific policy instruments, clear signaling of future market demands, and then providing key institutional support in the form of a dedicated investment institution. So crucially, that new national investment bank would be able to enhance commercial returns with social and environmental returns, financing projects that achieve welfare objectives, such as social housing, coastal defences, reforestation, as well as investments in biodiversity and nature, which I think, especially based on the absolutely terrifying report from the WWF this morning, are going to be the real next frontier in challenging our thinking as a finance community and how we actually monetize and deploy more capital towards biodiversity and nature. Finally, I think the investment bank could be a conduit for channeling large scale and global financing to local solutions by acting as a loan or deal aggregator. We need both the top-down vision, the vehicles and the institutions, as well as the bottom-up initiatives to drive this transition with a real focus on local delivery. I feel very passionate about this. I mean, we need to be working with local authorities, with the city regions, and with mayors to develop place-based solutions and programs that efficiently deploy public money locally to attract private investment. This underpins all our work at the Green Finance Institute, as does a strategic focus on sectoral pathways and obviously on collaboration. The sectors we've identified for our work include financing housing, transport, and coming soon, nature. These I view as being absolutely key for transitioning the UK to net zero, but also for creating jobs and building back a resilient and healthy economy. We're obviously not alone in highlighting those sectors. And alongside the technologies, and alongside all of those, we do need to look at the technologies to pivot the energy and the high carbon sectors, which have been so excitingly highlighted by DNV in their report. And these should all be initial areas of focus for a national investment bank to ensure resilience. With that, Sean, I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you, Rhian Marie, thank you. You said a few things that I think that apply everywhere. The need for national institutions like a national infrastructure bank is something that is common to all countries. The need to engage the municipal sector. This Preety is, we've talked about this in the Philippines and in Indonesia. And Rathin, we've talked about this, the need in India to try and get a municipal climate and green bond market. So these are very common issues that you're tackling within the UK context. Really important things to state. I want to now ask Nick Robbins, Professor in Practice at London School of Economics, to come in with some remarks to finish our initial lineup, and then we're going to take a few questions and comments, including of each other, by the way. Bear that in mind. You're all allowed to grill Rathin. That's perfectly allowable. Go, Nick.
Well, thank you, Sean, and thanks for inviting me to join the annual Climate Bond Summit and also this particular session. I really liked the focus on resilience for this century. I think that gives us the right horizon, and I'm very pleased to be following from Preety and Marcos and Rathin and Rhian and yourself in terms of my remarks. What I'd like to do, if I may, is maybe extend the sense of the moment we're at, the opportunity which Preety talks about, focus on sovereign bonds, and then thirdly, just think about some milestones going forward. And again, really endorse the statements you've made on the resilient COVID recovery. Sean, at the beginning, you started by talking about this really as one of the first crises of the sort of climate age, Anthropocene. This is also the first global crisis where sustainable finance, green finance, could make a difference. The global financial crisis, really green, sustainable finance was not in a position now. Clearly, we have unprecedented levels of commitment from investors, from banks, from central banks, from policymakers. And it's not now just an issue of ESG funds under management, but to what extent sustainable finance and sustainable finance community in fund managers, in the capital markets and so on, can make a real difference to coming out of this recovery in a much better shape, tackling the issues of inequality, tackling the degradation of nature. So I think there's actually this as we exit the crisis, the recovery could be very different. And perhaps what we want to avoid is what happened in 2009. The finance policy makers were thinking about fiscal stimulus. The climate negotiators were thinking about climate change. They all came to Copenhagen and they failed. We need to really be thinking, I think this is what is already happening, and we've heard from Marcos, is there's I think a real consensus about the Build Back Better, green recovery, inclusive recovery, resilient recovery. And I think therefore we have an opportunity to make sure that the capital markets and finance are very clearly linked with the climate objectives, and particularly when we come to COP26. And I think what you've set out in the Resilient Recovery two-pager is very helpful to, I think, probably once and for all, overcome the silos in our mind, the fragmentation in our mind between green and social and sustainable and so on. As Rhian Marie pointed to, we're looking at the potential for a sovereign bond in the UK under the banner of a green plus sovereign bond, because we know if you have a green bond which raises private capital for public purpose, for energy efficiency, for clean energy, for nature restoration and so on, that will also have a number of positive social impacts in terms of employment, in terms of skills, in terms of boosting the economies of deprived communities. And perhaps we haven't been recognizing how these two things could come together. So I think if we can think about this comprehensive approach, a green plus approach, that could really help. In your two-page statement, Sean, from the Climate Bonds Initiative on a resilient recovery, you do point to sovereign bonds as a particular asset class within capital markets, which could express the resilient recovery. And I think that's exactly right. Clearly, sovereign bonds are the asset class of the moment. We have the unprecedented issuance in many countries. As Marcos pointed to, we also have a number of countries, particularly in the developing world, who are facing severe debt stress. Their sovereign bonds are under pressure. So this is the asset class of the moment. We also have at the moment this focus on the coordination between finance ministries on the fiscal side and central banks on the monetary side. 90% of the holdings of the Bank of England is sovereign bonds. So again, sovereign bonds, and particularly if we think about sovereign bonds for a resilient recovery, really help connect the central bank community and the finance ministers. We also know sovereign bond issuance, the green sovereign bonds, and we've just had the German Bund being launched, can really help stimulate follow-on issuance by corporates, but also at the local level, as we've heard. And there is a real benefit of the transparency that sovereign bonds. I think that's one of the things, certainly talking to investors who are interested in developing and emerging markets, having the transparency that a certified green plus sovereign bond has improves the integrity of those bonds in terms of trust about how that money is going to be used and is not going to be wasted in corruption and other things. One theme maybe to pick up on in terms of the developing country dimension with others, including Mike Hugman, been thinking about actually to what extent could sustainable finance provide responses, particularly to developing country needs for capital. We've had very successful models, maybe on the corporate bond side, the IFC Amundi Green Bond Fund, whereby you can actually have the risk mitigated products which encourage private capital to crowd in, and also you build the pipeline of those assets through have a guaranteed buyer. I think we could think about a similar model on the sovereign side. And this would not just be one fund, but I could imagine every regionally based development bank, AIIB, ADB, Africa, Latin America, and the international, thinking about similar sort of sovereign bond funds with a partial guarantee, and therefore encouraging investors to come in and giving that flow of finance, which is so needed to developing countries. You could also have partially guaranteed sovereign bond issuance in terms of individual sovereign bonds, and often in local currencies, as we said. So I think you're right to pick out sovereign bonds as a particular asset class. Clearly, also the development bank bonds would come on behind, and then maybe just thinking ahead. We're thinking about this century of volatility. But one of the things that I think is very clear is the clear demand in the sort of financial community for us to move very quickly towards a green and inclusive recovery. And I think this notion of resilience, as you've highlighted, does help us. The work I've been doing with many others on just transition, a just transition is to build social resilience as we move to a net zero economy. So I think this really captured it. So if we were thinking a year ahead and we think to milestones, what is the quantum of issuance, let's say sovereign bonds, but other corporate bonds, and let's say sovereign bonds, that we would want to have under this resilient recovery banner? I think we could think of a quantum without being having any exaggeration of between 500 to $1 trillion on the sovereign bond side, given the quantum of issuance that's happening, given the demand, the need for allocations to fight social inequality, to fight environmental degradation. So I think that's a reasonable number. And then the question would be building that coalition of the issuers, the investors, the market makers, such as Climate Bonds Initiative, to make that happen. And I think that would give us a very nice target moving into COP26 of a continued issuance of different countries within that broad framework, that these would not just be isolated issuances, but would really be seen to be part of shifting that framework. So that's what I would hope to see over the next year. And I think Climate Bonds Initiative would be very well placed to help make that happen. And then looking to 2030, really ensuring that by that point, all sovereign bond issuance is consistent with the SDGs. Indeed, it has to, because that is the goal. So I think if we can work towards that, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. You've set us some big goals there, but as you say, eminently achievable going forward. We've got a few questions coming in. So I'm just going to ask one at this stage, which is, can we tackle global inequality without tackling the agenda that's been raised in Europe recently about redistribution of wealth? Let's call it the flow on from the Thomas Piketty agenda. In this context, can we actually successfully tackle global inequality while we're in the midst of this crisis? Or maybe I should turn this around to picking up Preety's point. Is there any choice but to try and tackle global inequality if we're ensuring resilience, looking to ensure the resilience of our societies, given there's now significant evidence about fragility, the relationship between fragility and inequality in societies? So let me just give you a riff about inequality to tease that out a bit more. I might start off with Preety, because you raised this issue before. And as Marcos and I have been saying, addressing inequality we see as a critical part of this whole agenda under the SDGs and linked to climate. But what do you think about the practicability of this aspect of the issue? You're still on mute, Preety.
Can I just...
Marcos, go in, yep.
While Preet comes, just to say that I don't think we have a choice here. And I think the greatest example, and Rathin mentioned in terms of inequality generating social unrest, and I think the greatest example of me of the yellow vest movement in France, right? As an example of a government trying to deal with the climate crisis, backfiring on social unrest because of inequality, which then makes that government pulls back on its policy on the climate crisis, right? So there is a direct link as governments try to go forward to deal with the climate crisis and put the right policies in place. Maybe you can say that the design of the French government policy was badly because it didn't account for how it would be addressing and dealing with, people that paid a price for it. But more and more, the policies government are going to have to put to deal with carbon pricing, to deal with subsidies, fuel subsidies and whatever, if it's not seen in the context of tackling inequality, is going to generate that social unrest. It's going to generate the backlash, right? So I think your second way to present the question, do we have a choice? We don't.
Preety.
Sure, if I may, and I completely agree with Marcos that, even the current crisis has shown that the social inequality has led to a multiplying of impacts. And, if we continue to ignore the social, aspects, be it related to any kind of crisis, it's going to pull us back, and there'll be political fallout, there'll be social fallout. And your question actually also touched upon global inequalities. I think global inequalities are important, but the first point of intervention should be at the national level. We cannot ignore the national level. I know the global inequality debate has been, raging for some time, but I think we have to turn it around first and look in-house in our own countries as well as a starting point.
Great point. Rathin, you've already made some very strong comments on this in your remarks, but do you want to add anything more?
No, I think if you looked around the world and look at the kind of regimes that we had in place in many countries, not New Zealand and not Canada, but almost everywhere else, you could see those as being the wages of having ignored inequality. So in a sense, this curse is already upon us, and we are paying the wages of incompetence and pandemic management because of the rise of populism. Yeah. So glad I don't work for government anymore, I can say these things.
Indeed, a very good point. And I guess that picks up the gender and education point that you were talking about, Preety, because we know that addressing gender and addressing it are critical factors in addressing inequality. So in this recovery and resilience agenda, I guess we need to bring those in, but can we, how hard is it really to identify what are the right things to do in that space, given what Rathin's mentioned earlier about the need to have clear understandings for governments about what are the climate and resilience investments, that reporting and transparency?
Well, you know, if I can give you an example from the current support that the Asian Development Bank is providing for the COVID crisis, I think we have been able to successfully bring in gender, you know, elements and ensure that the support is, you know, not conditional, but is linked to certain criteria which ensures gender equality in the support, be it in the social protection programs or be it, you know, in the support to small and medium enterprises. So we have built in those elements in our immediate, you know, relief support to the government. So I'm optimistic that it is possible, but it goes back to the paper that you have released. You know, having very robust guidelines is important, and again, you know, showing evidence. So you know, we can share evidence that that with this you know, relief packages, we have been able to integrate at least the gender dimensions related to equality of support, equality of support, if I may say.
There's a question. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to jump in with a slightly different take on this, which is the opportunity that we have as people who are so dedicated to ensuring that we see more finance going into climate, to turn this discussion to really bring everyone around to the table. Those that are still a little skeptical about climate, they obviously aren't skeptical about the need for leveling up. They're obviously not skeptical about the need for us to tackle inequality. And by reframing our conversation about climate to say, this is about creating the manufacturing jobs of the future, it's about creating employment, and it's about ensuring that we have climate stability. This is what will give our politicians the courage to make the bold decisions that they need to make in terms of climate, because they will see that it is landing with the electorate and certain demographics within the electorate who perhaps haven't always been as supportive of the climate discussions as those of us on this call. So I think there is you know, there is a chance for us to turn this around and change the narrative and turn it into an opportunity.
So what you're positing really is this idea of a grander coalition of interests being understood as one umbrella as the key point out of it.
I actually would love to, I really want to endorse what Rhian is saying. And that is why it is also important to move the balance of emphasis in these conversations away from just energy. It's also important because the climate, other than Ms. Thunberg and, you know, kids in the OECD, the conversation on these issues is profoundly technocratic. It may not look like that to you when the UN convenes a bunch of kids. Like, I can assure you, they're all very privileged kids. They all go to private school. My average Indian kid in a village is not involved in this conversation. It doesn't mean they don't have views. But if you bring in inequality, if you bring in futures, if you bring in unemployment, then you'll get those social movements that hold government to account, I think, on a much broader based basis than we're having now. That's also an important, I think, dimension to keep in mind. So I think I would completely endorse what Rhian said. That is the lens we need to bring to this conversation, starting from this conference.
So underlying this whole idea is a discussion about growth and sustainability and the link between the two. We've had a couple of people talk about on our Q&A page, shouldn't we be decoupling growth from economic development? That's a bit of a tough thing to sell someone in a village in India, perhaps. But on a global level, we've just seen a shrinking of the global growth and global economy, which has at least one benefit, which is emissions are down temporarily this year. I guess picking up this question of reframing arguments, what's the correct reframing of this growth and sustainability question then to respond to all of that, given we're actually going into negative, we've got to come out of it? I mean, I would be saying it's about ensuring longevity of growth in factors that aren't necessarily consistent with material consumption, which is health, education, participation, society and health, etc. Don't know.
Well, I think Rathin has a body of work, and he already mentioned, it is about the nature and quality of growth, right? So this notion that you decouple, right? I actually would argue that is the opposite. You have to simply say growth needs to deliver social inclusion, environmental boundaries, and so on and so forth. So you have to reframe what we value and how we define growth towards what Rathin was saying earlier in terms of inclusive and sustainable growth, right? Otherwise, the most important experiment of lifting people out of poverty it was China, and it was growth, right? Now you could say, not the right type of growth, but the point it is, can we lift millions and billions of people out of poverty without growth? I'm not sure. But the question is, what growth do we get? What growth do we value? What growth do we promote? And the expert is here, it's not me. I've been well indoctrinated by him.
And I think that's the seminal issue of our times, isn't it, Rathin? What kind of growth do we really want for our children? What's the world going to look like going forward?
Well, no, not if you live in a poor developing country. I have to ask the question now. What does growth mean for somebody who's 15 years old, no longer a child? That is my target audience, because in a young country like India or Indonesia, the 15 to 30-year-olds, those are the ones who can intervene to secure the future. So I'll give you one very simple question, which is quite interesting. Compared to the Green Revolution style, grow more food, raise yield per acre, do what it takes to pump fertilizer in, grow ethanol in Brazil, grow palm oil in Malaysia. Who benefited from that growth? Did farmers' incomes double? In India, the Green Revolution, the answer is a resounding no. So if I move to more sustainable zero-based actually farming, which is good for carbon emissions and good for the environment and economically with fertilizer, whose income will grow? I'm in the midst of that, showing that that is the way to double farmers' income. Similarly, in energy, no one asked this question except Nick Robbins, which is when we make a transition from coal to renewables to wind in the UK, for example, will that result in more employment that was given in the older ecosystem? This has to be part of a report that argues for, a movement to wind energy or solar or whatever. And that's not been the case so far. So employment in the sense of who participates, then your growth story is answered. If people participate in delivering output and you get growth as a consequence of that, you reduce inequality. The fewer people that participate in delivering output, the more inequality goes up. So I think that's the choice Marcos was very correctly highlighting.
We need to wrap up. Can you believe this? Next steps. What I'm after now, where do we take this? Rhian, can I start with you? You've been banging on the door of Treasury for some time, I have to say. So Robert Steetham is, I don't know, maybe coming around, or number 10. How do we make this and how do we expand this agenda in one national context, the UK, to get us going on, for everyone, how we take this forward?
I do think you're referencing the banging on the door to have a UK sovereign issuance. We are absolutely doing our utmost And we actually, in terms of very concrete next steps, because I am nothing if I'm not practical, we have an investor roundtable this afternoon, actually getting some real life market commentary on the back of the success of the German Bund and the Swedish issuance last week on how investors would respond to a green plus issuance in the UK, which we fully intend to share with, I must say, a very engaged and receptive Treasury Department in the UK, very interested in seeing what the market has to say about this. So I'm in the run up to COP and with the UK's G7 presidency next year, I think this is an unprecedented moment for us to really be pushing hard as an investment community to say that we want to see a UK sterling green bond in order to actually help build our UK sterling green bond credentials and that market, which to date, the UK corporates have been a little slow really taking advantage of the green bond market. So with your help, Sean, as well, I'm sure we can get there.
Thank you, Rhian. Preety.
Well, let me start, looking inwards internally at the Asian Development Bank before I go on to the national level. Of course, we are looking at the bonds market. We have issued bonds, as you know very well, Sean. But the work that we are doing with you in the ASEAN countries, I think provides us with a very good entry point to look at what are the conditions for successful issuance of bonds. But apart from, looking at how we can support the countries from ADB's perspective, I think the conversation within the organization is also very, very important in bringing all these elements together. We have a very exciting social development program, but which is kind of, not building in the climate aspects or the resilience aspects from the environment point of view. So those are the kind of challenges that internally, institutionally, we are overcoming. And, our strategy 2030 has very, centrally placed resilience in the vision, and looking at resilience exactly in the construct that you have developed for this particular session. So as an institution, we are making those strides, but our strength also comes in with the opportunities we have in our policy dialogues with the countries. And that's where, work of the Climate Bonds Initiative and the other work that we are doing with the ASEAN Catalytic Green Financing Facility becomes very, very important in moving this discussion forward. Thank you.
Nick.
Thank you, Sean. I mean, I think just adding to the urgency, I think we haven't highlighted that although the real economy and consumption is hurting, and clearly that's having huge impacts on inequality. Actually, if you look at the world of the global equity markets, in particular the US equity markets, there seems to be a big disjunction about the sort of state of that market and the state of the real economy. So I think we've got to bring these two worlds together, the planet finance and the real world of the planet we live on. So again, I think showing that through the bond market that we can deliver instruments which tie the savings of ordinary people around the world with real economy outcomes, environment, social and economic. The more we can do that, sovereign bonds again, I think are a perfect instrument of that, bringing the UK on board. And then I would see broadening that list of issuers so that we get, I would imagine, probably 50 issuers by the end of next year. That would be great to see.
There's a clear target for all the development banks and commercial banks that are listening into this call. That's what we have to do. Thank you, Nick, for that. Marcos.
Flipping on Preety, on the global side, on the policy side, I think, pushing this and with help of you all listening to this, pushing the agenda on this recovery better for sustainability in the formal UN process and the policies that I've described it to you and we can share will become very important, right? Will become very important to build that consensus, and how much as anyone can influence their own domestic governments around the world to come that way, I think will be very, very important. part of that process, and I think linked to the bond conversation, is kind of bringing closer together, you know, this larger coalition, you know, so climate, social, blue, all coming together, I think becomes quite important to then flip the narrative, as Rhian mentioned, right? I think that's an important one. And I think from UNDP point of view, for us to carry on, you know, kind of take all of this conversation inside this big piece of work we're doing for the G7 and negotiating with the G20 to take forward on a sustainable finance framework, where bonds is in there in the pillar of instruments, it's very important, you know, in that sense. Putting those standards for SDG bonds and private equity out in the market and let the market play with it, I think it's also something we're committed to do. And then Sean, yours and my project on which now the European Union has agreed, you know, which is to expand its taxonomy from green to all other social aspects. I think creating a mechanism by which governments can take on taxonomy domestically, nationally, that are comparable, I think are going to be very important going forward. Now, somebody got to deal with the debt. You know, Mr. Roy is not concerned about it, but man, this is all that I'm hearing. It's the debt, the debt, the debt.
I think that's a great segue to Mr. Roy.
Yes, Marcos, I guess I'm a bit biased because I'm not from a developing country that is capital account convertible. For which simple reason, we don't issue foreign currency dominated bonds. We tried to, I stopped it, and long may that persist. Having said that, I'll just close with 3 points. I think there is an opportunity in the UK context wearing my new hat. I think what Rhian said is very important. And that lies in our ability to persuade HMG that for the UK to pursue its desired good relationships with large emerging economies like India and China, there is opportunity for that to happen with placement of significant amount of sovereign paper in the UK market, because the UK market doesn't just have to be studied, but then comfort regarding, you know, exchange rate movements and sovereign resilience to unfavorable ratings interventions. In simple language for everyone, our common fear is we don't want to be Argentina. So apologies to all Argentinians, I'm sure you agree with me in this context of debt. So that comfort should come. So if you're going to do these bilateral arrangements, then, you know, things like swaps should be seen as independent of products like bonds, and that would be a productive conversation to have. At the multilateral level, I'm delighted that the UNDP is now involved in this conversation. I think we will need to see whether the IMF is able to look at green and other such bonds, whether issued in local currency or otherwise, as ways in a transition where the last step is monetization of the fiscal deficit, because that is the nuclear option. And so the more favorable you and the greater the quality and quantity of bonds that a sovereign can issue, and the greater the debt, you know, sustainability comfort, which is the IMF's job, the better it is. And UNDP could come in. I don't know any other part of the UN system that could do it better now that Marcos is in charge. UNDP could come in and you know, provide the technology for linking these to the outcomes we were discussing, resilience and inequality. I think that would be a very fruitful multilateral coalition. Finally, I think if we are successful in this, then that last step in convincing, you know, governments that both sovereign, sub-sovereign and municipal level issuances are a significant way out of the financial hole they find themselves in, and address the imperatives of, you know, raising employment, increasing productive inclusion and dealing with inequality. If we can have that sort of conversation now when we pitch for green bonds, then I think this is going to be mainstream. Your dream, Sean, which is that every sovereign bond issue is green, would then come true. And I hope it does.
Thank you. Listeners, we're in the middle of a crisis. It's a pandemic, but it's also a crisis of sustainability. First, because the pandemic is part of what we've done to the planet. It comes from the collapse of biodiversity and environmental systems. It is the norm. Whenever we've seen climate fluctuations in the past, there are associations with pandemics. It's no surprise to historians. There will be more, according to the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There will be other crises, whether that be floods or droughts or collapse of crops, which we're already seeing in some part at the moment as a result of the pandemic. We will have a century of volatility. We won't survive this century. And let me state that again. We will not survive this century as a civilization unless we work together. We will not survive this era of extreme volatility unless we find a way to collaborate to address the challenges that are clearly ahead of us. And that includes the challenge of how to make our societies, our countries, our towns and our villages more resilient in the face of the volatility that we know is coming, as certainly as a weather forecaster predicting a rainstorm and looking out the window to check it's there. We are certain it's coming, folks. In this crisis, we are learning some extremely hard lessons as we mourn our losses, and there are many more to come yet before this is over. We need to understand that the things that we have got right and we've got wrong provide us a toolkit for what we have to do in the future. We need access to health for all. That's about resilience of our societies, resilience of our economies, as well as the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, not intrinsic right in its own right. We need greater equality to ensure that the way the poor have suffered inordinately in this crisis is not repeated, because if we don't fix that, the pandemic spreads faster. And of course, we need to ensure that while we're doing that, we address the financial stability of our organizations, our countries, our companies, our pension funds. And that's what was said in the previous session earlier by Frank Elderson, Satoshi Ikeda, Rick LaCale, and others. It's transition. It's a time for transition. Yes, transition to low carbon, but also, yes, transition to resilience, with all of these things part of it. And let's use the sovereign issuance that we're going to have to do. Put aside the debt challenge, it's there. We are going to be issuing in bulk to restart our economies. That argument is one. Let's ensure that it's the right kind of issuance to address these issues going forward. Thank you everyone for joining us in the panel. It's been a delight to have you, and I have to say it has been extraordinarily stimulating. My brain is buzzing. I don't know about you. Preety, Marcos, Nick, Rathin, Rhian, Murray, I wish you so much success in your endeavours. It's so important that you are successful, and I wish us all success in our collaboration in addressing this challenge going forward. For our listeners, take this message out and share it with your governments, share it with policymakers, build a market. That's one of the things we're going to do out of this, and build change in your societies. Thank you everyone for joining us. I just want to make a last secret thank you to Alicia Bastos, our head of events, who has made this conference happen. Without her, it would have been impossible. And thank you to our sponsors, of course, who have been critical to allowing, giving us the resources to do it. We have one more session in 15 minutes with a panel looking at implications for bond market. And then if you're really keen, a half an hour after that, I'm going to present my 10 steps to 2030, 10 steps for the next 10 years. Over and out. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.